David sat at his kitchen table, staring at the computer screen. The cursor blinked on the empty message box. He'd been trying to write this email for 20 minutes, but every time he started typing, the words felt wrong. Looking for someone to share my life with, he typed, then deleted it. Too desperate. Successful rancher seeking companionship, he tried again. Delete. Too cold. The truth was, David never thought he'd be doing this at 38 years old. 3 years ago, he had a wife, a plan, and hope for the future. Then Claire left him. For her boss in the city, taking half of everything and leaving him with a mountain of debt and a broken heart. His ranch in Montana stretched for miles, but most evenings it felt like the loneliest place on earth. The cattle didn't care if he talked to them, and his nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away. His sister kept telling him to get back out there, maybe try those dating apps. But David had tried. The women he met online either lived too far away or took one look at his rural lifestyle and disappeared. That's how he ended up on this website. International Connections, it was called. His buddy Jake had met his wife through a similar service 5 years ago, and they seemed happy enough. Jake had been the one to finally push him into it. "Look, David," Jake had said over beers at Murphy's Bar, "you're a good man. You work hard, you're honest, and you've got a lot to offer, but you're not going to find anyone around here. There's maybe 3 single women left in this whole county, and 2 of them are my cousins." So here David was, scrolling through profiles of women from different countries, Philippines, Ukraine, Colombia. Each profile told a story of someone looking for a better life, someone willing to take a chance on love with a stranger. Then he saw her picture. Rosa had kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was 28 from a small town outside Manila. Her profile said she worked as a teacher but dreamed of continuing her education. She wanted children someday and believed in traditional family values. David spent an hour reading her profile over and over. She seemed real, not like some of the others that felt too good to be true. Rosa wrote about loving to cook, wanting to learn about different cultures, and hoping to find someone who valued loyalty and hard work. He took a deep breath and started typing. "Hi Rosa, my name is David. I live on a cattle ranch in Montana. I saw your profile and felt like we might have some things in common. I work hard every day, and I believe in treating people with respect. If you'd like to know more about me, I'd love to hear from you." He hit send before he could change his mind. 2 days later, Rosa replied. Her English was good, though not perfect, which somehow made her seem more genuine. She asked about his ranch, what his days were like, what he did for fun. Simple questions, but David found himself writing long responses. Their correspondence grew over the weeks. Rosa told him about her family, her mother who cleaned houses, her younger brother who worked construction, her father who had died when she was 16. Money was tight, she explained, but education was important to her family. She had been saving for years to get her teaching degree, but it was slow going. David shared his own story. The divorce, the financial struggles, the isolation of ranch life. He told her about getting up before dawn to feed cattle, about fixing fences in, the blazing summer heat, about the satisfaction of seeing healthy calves born in spring. "It sounds peaceful," Rosa wrote back. "Here in the city, there is always noise, always rushing. I think I would like to see wide open spaces." As months passed, their emails became longer and more personal. Rosa sent pictures of her cooking traditional Filipino dishes. David sent photos of his ranch, the rolling hills, the cattle grazing in the distance. They talked about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. "I will be honest with you," Rosa wrote in one email. "I'm looking for security, yes, but also kindness. I have seen too many women marry men who treat them badly. My friend Maria, she married a man who promised her everything, but he was cruel. I would rather be poor and alone than rich and afraid." David appreciated her honesty. "I can't promise you riches," he wrote back. "Ranch life is hard work and uncertain income. But I can promise you respect and loyalty. I've been hurt before, and I know what it feels like. I would never want to cause that pain to someone else." Their relationship deepened through these exchanges. Rosa shared her love of reading, her dream of maybe teaching children in America someday. David told her about his plans to expand the ranch, maybe add some horses, possibly start offering tours to city folks who wanted to experience rural life. "You make it sound like an adventure," Rosa wrote. "I have always been too scared to take big risks, but talking to you makes me feel brave." The turning point came 6 months into their correspondence. David's sister had been in a car accident, nothing life-threatening, but she needed surgery and would be laid up for weeks. David spent 3 days at the hospital, handling her affairs, making sure she was comfortable. When he finally got home and checked his email, Rosa had sent him 4 messages, each one more worried than the last. "I hope you are okay," she wrote. "I know we have never met in person, but I care about you. Please let me know you are safe." Something about her concern touched David deeply. This woman, thousands of miles away, was worried about him. When had anyone last cared enough to worry? He called her that night. It was their first phone conversation, and both of them were nervous. Rosa's accent was stronger over the phone, but her voice was warm and musical. They talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. "I keep thinking," David said near the end of the call, "maybe it's time we met in person." There was a long pause. "I have been thinking the same thing," Rosa said quietly. "But I am scared. What if we don't like each other? What if it's different in person?" "Then we'll deal with that," David said. "But what if we do like each other? What if this is real?" They spent weeks planning. David would send Rosa a plane ticket. She would come to Montana for a month, and they would see if what they had built, through letters and phone calls, could work in real life. If things went well, they would get married before her visa expired. It felt like a huge gamble to both of them. David was investing thousands of dollars and opening his heart to someone he'd never met. Rosa was leaving everything she knew for a man and a life that might not be what she hoped. But as David printed out the plane ticket at the FedEx store in town, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Maybe this crazy plan would work. Maybe he wouldn't spend the rest of his life alone on the ranch. Rosa, packing her single suitcase in her small apartment in Manila, felt the same mixture of terror and excitement. She was about to change her entire life based on 6 months of emails and phone calls. It was either the bravest thing she'd ever done or the most foolish. Either way, there was no turning back now. The ticket was bought, the plans were made. In 2 weeks, she would board a plane to America and discover if the connection she felt with David was real, or just a beautiful dream that would crumble in the harsh light of reality. David's hands were sweating as he waited at the small airport in Billings. He'd driven 3 hours to get there, changing his shirt twice before leaving the ranch. The plane from Seattle was 20 minutes late, and every minute felt like an hour. He kept checking his phone, looking at Rosa's last photo. What if she looked completely different in person? What if there was no chemistry between them? What if this whole thing was a terrible mistake? When passengers finally started coming through the gate, David's heart pounded. He held up the small sign with Rosa's name, feeling ridiculous. Then he saw her. Rosa looked exactly like her photos, but somehow more real. She was smaller than he'd imagined, pulling a worn suitcase that looked like it had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a blue dress that was clearly her best outfit. When their eyes met, Rosa smiled nervously. David felt a wave of relief. She was really here. "David?" she asked, her accent making his name sound musical. "That's me," he said, suddenly feeling awkward. Should he hug her, shake her hand? He settled for taking her suitcase. "How was your flight?" "Very long," Rosa laughed. "But I made it." The drive back to the ranch was filled with nervous conversation. Rosa pressed her face to the window, amazed by the wide-open spaces. "It's so big," she kept saying. "So much sky." David found himself relaxing as they talked. Rosa was exactly as she'd been in their phone calls, warm, curious, a little shy, but genuinely interested in everything around her. "Are you hungry?" David asked as they pulled up to his house. "I made dinner. Well, I tried to make dinner." Rosa smiled. "I'm always hungry. What did you make?" "Beef stew." "It's probably terrible. I'm not much of a cook." I love to cook, Rosa said. Maybe I can teach you some Filipino dishes? The first few days went better than David had dared to hope. Rosa was everything he'd expected and more. She was up early every morning, insisting on helping with the cattle. She learned quickly and wasn't afraid of hard work in the evenings. She cooked amazing meals that filled the house with incredible smells. She made adobo chicken that was better than anything David had ever tasted, and lumpia that disappeared as fast as she could make them. Where did you learn to cook like this? David asked one evening, going back for his third helping. My mother, Rosa said. She always said a woman should know how to feed her family well. Food is love, she would tell me. David felt something warm spread through his chest. The house felt alive again, filled with cooking smells and Rosa's gentle humming as she worked. But David started noticing small things. Rosa would sometimes rush to the bathroom in the mornings. She seemed tired more often than made sense for someone her age. Once, he caught her standing in front of the mirror, turning sideways and looking at her reflection with a worried expression. Are you feeling okay? He asked one morning when she looked particularly pale. Yes, just tired from the travel still, Rosa said quickly. I'm fine. David didn't push it. Maybe she was just adjusting to the altitude and the different food? Or maybe she was nervous about their situation. He knew he was. 2 weeks after Rosa arrived, David decided to take her to Murphy's Bar to meet some of the locals. He was proud to show her off, and Rosa seemed excited to meet people from the community. You look beautiful, David told her as they got ready to go. Rosa had put on a pretty yellow dress, but David noticed she kept adjusting it, pulling at the fabric around her waist. Murphy's Bar was the social center of their small town. When David walked in with Rosa, conversations stopped. Everyone wanted to meet the woman who traveled halfway around the world to be with their neighbor. Rosa was charming. She asked questions about people's families, complimented the local women on their clothes, and listened with genuine interest to stories about life in Montana. David watched her win over person after person with her warmth and kindness. She's a keeper, old Pete Murphy whispered to David at the bar. You done. Good, son. David felt a surge of pride and something deeper. Maybe this crazy plan was actually working. Maybe he'd found someone who could be a real partner. Then it happened. Rosa was talking to Mrs. Henderson about her flower garden when she suddenly went very pale. She grabbed the edge of the table, swaying slightly. Rosa? David was at her side. Instantly, I'm okay, she said, but her voice was weak. Just dizzy. Then her eyes rolled back and she collapsed. The next few minutes were a blur. Someone called 911. David caught Rosa as she fell, his heart racing with panic. She was unconscious but breathing. Old Doc Stevens, who happened to be having dinner at the bar, checked her pulse and said they needed to get her to the hospital. Right away, David rode in the ambulance, holding Rosa's hand and praying she was okay. She came to during the ride, confused and embarrassed. What happened? She asked weakly. You fainted, David said. We're going to the hospital to make sure you're okay. At the hospital, the doctor was thorough. He asked Rosa lots of questions while David waited outside. When the doctor finally came out, his expression was serious. Mr. Thompson, the doctor said, I need to speak with you privately. They walked to a quiet corner of the waiting room. David's mind raced with terrible possibilities. Was Rosa sick? Did she have some condition she hadn't told him about? Your fiancée is pregnant, the doctor said simply. About 4 months along, I'd say. David felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. That's not possible. I'm afraid it is. She's going to be fine, but she needs to take better care of herself. Pregnancy can be tough, especially with all the stress of moving to a new country. David stared at the doctor, trying to process what he was hearing. Pregnant, 4 months. That meant ... Rosa was already pregnant when she'd agreed to come to America. She'd been pregnant during all those weeks of planning. When she was packing her suitcase, when she was telling him how excited she was to start their new life together, she had lied to him. When David walked back into Rosa's room, she took one look at his face and started crying. David, I can explain ... 4 months, David said quietly. The doctor says you're 4 months pregnant. Rosa's tears came harder. I was going to tell you ... quote. When? After we got married? After I'd committed to supporting someone else's child? It's not like that, Rosa whispered. I was scared. I didn't know how to tell you. David felt anger building in his chest, but also something worse. Disappointment. He'd started to believe in this crazy fairy tale. He'd started to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found someone who genuinely cared about him, not just what he could provide. Who's the father? David asked. Rosa's face crumpled. He left when I told him. He said it wasn't his problem. So, you thought it would be mine? No, Rosa said urgently. David, please listen to me. I didn't plan this. I was already pregnant when I first wrote to you, but I didn't know yet. By the time I found out, we had been talking for months. I thought ... I hoped maybe it wouldn't matter to you. David ran his hands through his hair. Everything felt upside down. 3 hours ago, he'd been thinking about proposing properly, maybe buying Rosa a ring. Now he felt like a fool. I need some air, David said. He walked out of the hospital and sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the mountains in the distance. Part of him wanted to drive away and never come back. He could leave Rosa here, let her figure out her own way home. He didn't owe her anything, but another part of him remembered how she'd looked when she was learning to handle the cattle, how proud she'd been when she'd successfully gotten the stubborn old bull back into his pen. He remembered her face when she'd first seen the ranch, the wonder in her eyes. Had all of that been fake? Had she just been playing a part? When David finally went back inside, Rosa was dressed and ready to leave. Her eyes were red from crying, but her jaw was set with determination. I understand if you want me to go home, she said quietly. I know I should have told you sooner. I was wrong. David looked at her for a long moment. The smart thing would be to put her on a plane tomorrow, cut his losses and go back to his quiet, lonely life, but something stopped him. Maybe it was the way she'd thrown herself into ranch work, or how she'd charmed everyone at Murphy's Bar, or just the fact that she was thousands of miles from home with nowhere else to go. We'll get married as planned, David said finally. For your immigration status, but this isn't a real marriage anymore. You'll have your own room, and after the baby comes, we'll figure out what happens next. Rosa nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. Thank you. As they drove home in silence, David wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He thought he was getting a wife and partner. Instead, he was getting a pregnant stranger and a responsibility he'd never asked for. The fairy tale was over before it had really begun. The courthouse wedding was the most awkward 15 minutes of David's life. He wore his only good suit, the same one he'd worn to his sister's wedding 3 years ago. Rosa wore a simple white dress she'd bought at the discount store in town. Looking beautiful despite everything, Judge Martinez had performed hundreds of weddings, but even he seemed to sense the tension in the room. There were no flowers, no guests, no celebration. Just two people going through the motions for legal purposes. Do you, David Thompson, take Rosa to be your lawfully wedded wife? David's jaw was tight as he answered, I do. Do you, Rosa Mendez, take David to be your lawfully wedded husband? Rosa's voice was barely a whisper. I do. When the judge said they could kiss, David simply shook Rosa's hand. The whole thing felt like a business transaction, which David supposed it was. On the drive home, Rosa tried to break the silence. David, I know things are difficult right now, but maybe we can ... Let's just focus on getting through this. David cut her off. We both know why we're here. Back at the ranch, David showed Rosa to the spare bedroom. It was small but clean, with a single bed and a dresser. He'd moved some of his mother's old furniture in there, a rocking chair and a small bookshelf. This is your room? He said formally. The bathroom is down the hall. Dinner is usually at 6. Rosa nodded, clutching her suitcase. Thank you. That first week was painful for both of them. David left early for work and came home late, barely speaking to Rosa except when necessary. Rosa spent her days unpacking her few belongings and trying to figure out her place in this house that felt more like a prison than a home. But Rosa wasn't the type to sit around feeling sorry for herself. She was 5 months pregnant now, her belly clearly showing, but she was determined to pull her weight. She started by deep cleaning the house, which clearly hadn't seen a woman's touch in years. David came home one evening to find his kitchen spotless and something delicious simmering on the stove. Rosa was outside painting the fence posts that had been weathered gray for as long as he could remember. She'd somehow found old paint in his garage and was carefully applying fresh white coats. "You don't have to do that," David said, watching her work. Rosa looked up, paint streaks on her cheek. "The house is my home too now. I want it to look nice." David felt a strange twist in his chest. "Just be careful. Don't overdo it." As weeks passed, Rosa continued making changes around the ranch. She planted a small vegetable garden near the kitchen window. She organized David's chaotic office, creating a simple filing system that actually made sense. She learned to help with the cattle, moving slowly but steadily as her pregnancy progressed. The local veterinarian, Dr. Peterson, was a kind man in his 70s who'd been taking care of animals in the area for decades. His own wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and he often seemed lonely when he came by to check on David's cattle. One afternoon, Dr. Peterson arrived to find Rosa sitting on the porch mending one of David's work shirts. "Well, hello there," he said with a genuine smile. "You must be the new Mrs. Thompson?" Rosa smiled back. "Please call me Rosa. Would you like some coffee I just made fresh?" From that day on, Dr. Peterson started staying for coffee whenever he visited the ranch. Rosa would listen to his stories about his late wife, Margaret, and his 40 years of veterinary practice. In return, she told him about her family in the Philippines, her dreams of becoming a teacher, and her fears about raising a child in a foreign country. "You know," Dr. Peterson said one afternoon, watching Rosa knead dough for fresh bread, "Margaret would have liked you. She always said a home isn't made by fancy furniture or expensive decorations. It's made by someone who cares enough to put love into the little things." David often overheard these conversations from his office, though he pretended not to listen. He noticed how Rosa's face lit up when Dr. Peterson arrived, how eager she was for adult conversation and companionship. It made him realize how isolated she must feel. The people in town slowly began to warm up to Rosa. At first, they'd been curious about the pregnant mail-order bride who'd married David Thompson. Small towns loved gossip, and David knew people were talking. But Rosa's genuine kindness and willingness to help gradually won them over. When Mrs. Henderson from the flower shop fell and sprained her ankle, Rosa showed up at her house the next morning with homemade soup and an offer to help with housework. When the Johnson family's barn caught fire, Rosa was there with sandwiches and coffee for the volunteers helping to rebuild. "That girl's got a good heart," David overheard Pete Murphy telling someone at the feed store. "Don't matter where she came from or why she's here, she's proving herself every day." David found himself watching Rosa more closely. She never complained about her situation, never asked him for money for herself, never made demands. When she needed maternity clothes, she shopped at the thrift store and altered them herself. When she craved foods from home, she found ways to make them with ingredients from the local grocery store. One evening, David came home to find Rosa sitting at the kitchen table with books spread around her. She was working on something with intense concentration. "What's all this?" he asked. Rosa looked up, slightly embarrassed. "I'm studying for my GED. Dr. Peterson brought me the books. I never finished high school in the Philippines, and I thought maybe I could do it here." David was surprised. "That's a lot of work." "I have time in the evenings," Rosa said, "and I want to be able to help my child with homework someday. How can I expect them to value education if I don't have it myself?" Despite himself, David felt a flicker of admiration. Here was a woman who was pregnant, living with a man who barely spoke to her, in a country where she knew almost no one, and she was still trying to better herself. Winter came early that year. Rosa was 7 months pregnant and moving more slowly, but she insisted on helping with the morning chores. David watched her waddle out to feed the chickens, bundled up in his old coat because she didn't have proper winter gear. "You shouldn't be out here," he told her one particularly cold morning. It's icy. The chickens need to eat, Rosa replied simply, and I need the fresh air. That afternoon, David drove to town and bought Rosa a proper winter coat, warm boots, and insulated gloves. When he gave them to her, Rosa's eyes filled with tears. You didn't have to do this, she said. Can't have you slipping on the ice, David said gruffly. Ad for the baby. But they both knew it was about more than practicality. As Rosa's due date approached, the atmosphere in the house began to shift subtly. David found himself asking about her doctor appointments, making sure she was eating enough, worrying when she was quiet for too long. One snowy evening, Rosa was making dinner when she suddenly gasped and grabbed the counter. David was at her side instantly. What's wrong? Just the baby kicking, Rosa said with a small smile. He's very active today. Without thinking, David looked at her belly. He? I think it's a boy, Rosa said. Just a feeling. For a moment they stood there in the warm kitchen, the smell of Rosa's cooking filling the air, snow falling outside the windows. It felt almost like they were a real family. Then David stepped back, remembering the walls he'd built around his heart, but those walls were starting to crack. Piece by piece, day by day, late at night, when David thought Rosa was asleep, he sometimes heard her talking softly in her room. At first, he thought she was on the phone with her family. Then he realized she was talking to her unborn baby, telling stories in a mixture of English and her native language, singing gentle lullabies. Your papa is a good man, he heard her say one night. He's hurt right now, but he has a kind heart. I hope someday you'll understand why things are the way they are. David lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering why Rosa's words made his chest feel so tight. The baby wasn't his. Rosa had lied to him. Their marriage was just paperwork. So why did he find himself caring what happened to both of them? Winter deepened, and with it the strange, quiet intimacy of two people sharing a house in a complicated situation. Neither of them spoke about feelings or the future, but in the small daily kindnesses, Rosa leaving David's coffee ready in the morning, David making sure the house was warm before Rosa got up, something was slowly changing, something that neither of them was quite ready to name. The first contraction hit Rosa at 3 a.m. during the worst snowstorm Montana had seen in 5 years. She woke up with a sharp pain across her belly and lay still for a moment, hoping it was just the baby moving. Then another wave of pain came, stronger this time. Rosa quietly got out of bed and walked to her window. Outside, snow was falling so heavily she could barely see the barn 50 feet away. The wind was howling like a wild animal, and snow was piling up against the house in deep drifts. Another contraction made her grip the windowsill. This was really happening. Rosa padded down the hall to David's room and knocked softly on his door. David? She heard him moving inside, then the door opened. David's hair was messy from sleep, and he was wearing an old t-shirt and pajama pants. What's wrong? He asked, immediately alert. I think the baby is coming, Rosa said quietly. David's eyes went wide. Now? But you're not due for another 2 weeks. Babies don't always follow schedules, Rosa said, managing a small smile despite another contraction building. David looked out his window at the storm and his face went pale. The roads would be impossible to drive in this weather. Even if they could make it to his truck, the 20-mile drive to the hospital would be deadly. Okay, David said, running his hands through his hair. Okay, let me call Dr. Peterson. David's hands shook as he dialed the veterinarian's number. Dr. Peterson answered on the third ring, his voice groggy with sleep. David, what's wrong? Rosa's having the baby, David said, right now, and we're snowed in. There was a pause. How far apart are the contractions? David looked at Rosa, who was breathing through another one. Rosa, how long between the pains? Maybe 5 minutes, she gasped. 5 minutes, David repeated into the phone. All right, son. Dr. Peterson's voice became calm and professional. I can't get to you in this storm, but I can talk you through this. First, boil some water and find clean towels. Lots of them. The next few hours were the longest of David's life. He followed Dr. Peterson's instructions over the crackling phone. line helping Rosa get comfortable timing her contractions. Trying to stay calm when everything inside him was screaming with panic. Rosa was amazing. Even through the pain, she stayed focused and brave. She squeezed David's hand during contractions and smiled at him between them. "I'm sorry this is happening like this," she whispered during a quiet moment. "Don't apologize," David said firmly. "You're doing great." As the hours passed, David found himself talking to Rosa to keep her calm. He told her stories about growing up on the ranch, about his parents, about the first time he delivered a calf by himself when he was 16. "You delivered a calf?" Rosa asked during a break between contractions. "Lots of them," David said. "Though I have to admit this is a little different," Rosa actually laughed. "Just a little." When the moment finally came, David was terrified. But Dr. Peterson's voice on the phone was steady and reassuring, guiding him through each step. And then suddenly there was a tiny cry filling the room. David looked down at the small, perfect baby in his hands and felt something break open in his chest. The baby was so small, so fragile, but his lungs were strong and his cry was demanding. "It's a boy," David said, his voice rough with emotion. Rosa was crying and laughing at the same time. "Is he okay? Is he healthy?" David carefully cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a soft blanket Rosa had prepared. The little boy had a full head of dark hair and was waving his tiny fists in the air. "He's perfect," David said, gently placing the baby in Rosa's arms. Rosa looked down at her son with pure love shining in her eyes. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I'm your mama." David watched them together and felt something he hadn't expected, a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. This wasn't his child, he reminded himself. But looking at the tiny boy nestled against Rosa's chest, those facts seemed less important somehow. "What will you call him?" David asked softly. Rosa looked up at him with tears in her eyes. "Would it be okay if I named him after your father? You told me his name was Antonio. In my language we would say Antonio too." David felt his throat get tight. His father had died when David was 20, and David had always regretted that his dad never got to see the ranch succeed or meet any grandchildren. "He would have been honored," David said quietly. Over the next few weeks, David watched Rosa settle into motherhood with natural grace. She was tired, of course, but she seemed to glow with happiness as she cared for little Antonio. David found himself drawn to the baby in ways he hadn't expected. When Antonio cried in the middle of the night, David would lie awake listening, ready to help if Rosa needed anything. When she was exhausted from sleepless nights, David would take the baby so she could shower or rest. "You don't have to do this," Rosa said one evening when David was walking around the living room with a fussy Antonio. "I know," David said, gently bouncing the baby, "but he's part of this household now." The truth was, David was falling in love with the little boy. Antonio had the most expressive dark eyes David had ever seen, and when he looked at David, it felt like he was really seeing him. The baby had a strong grip and would hold tight to David's finger when he was being fed or changed. Dr. Peterson visited regularly to check on Rosa and the baby. He was delighted with how well both of them were doing and clearly enjoyed his role as honorary grandfather. "That boy's got character," Dr. Peterson said one afternoon, watching Antonio kick his legs during a diaper change. "Look at those strong legs. He's going to be a runner, this one." "He's already keeping us all running," David said with a tired smile. As winter began to soften into early spring, David realized how much his life had changed. The house felt different now, warmer, fuller, more alive. Rosa's gentle humming as she worked, Antonio's cries and coos, the sound of Rosa talking softly to the baby, all of it had become the soundtrack of David's daily life. One evening, David came home from checking on a sick cow to find Rosa sitting in the rocking chair, nursing Antonio. The late afternoon sun was streaming through the window, creating a golden glow around them both. Rosa was singing softly in her native language, a lullaby that sounded like a prayer. David stopped in the doorway, struck by how beautiful and peaceful the scene was. This was what a family looked like, he realized. This was what he'd been missing all these years. Rosa looked up and saw him watching. "How is the cow?" She be fine, David said. Just ate something that didn't agree with her. Like someone else I know, Rosa said with a smile, looking down at Antonio, who had finished eating and was now making contented baby sounds. David sat down on the couch across from them. Can I hold him? Rosa's face lit up. Of course. As David took Antonio in his arms, the baby looked up at him with those serious dark eyes. Then, unexpectedly, Antonio smiled, his first real smile that wasn't just gas. Did you see that? David said, his voice full of wonder. He smiled at me. He knows you, Rosa said softly. You've been taking such good care of both of us. David looked down at the tiny boy in his arms and felt his heart do something complicated. Antonio reached up with one small hand and grabbed David's thumb, holding on with surprising strength. In that moment, David realized that somewhere along the way, without him noticing, this had stopped being about obligation or duty. Somewhere between Rosa's arrival and Antonio's birth, between the long winter nights and the gradual warming of spring, David had started to care about both of them in a way that had nothing to do with their original arrangement. The baby wasn't his, but as David looked into Antonio's trusting eyes, that fact seemed to matter less and less. Later that evening, after Rosa had gone to bed with Antonio, David sat alone in his kitchen, thinking about how drastically his life had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a lonely bachelor going through the motions of daily ranch work. Now he was living with a woman and baby who felt more like family than anything he'd experienced since his parents died. It scared him, this growing attachment. Rosa had lied to him once. What if she left when she got her citizenship? What if she decided ranch life wasn't what she wanted after all? But as he heard Rosa's soft voice from down the hall, talking quietly to Antonio as she settled him for the night, David realized he didn't want to think about those possibilities. For the first time in years, he was happy. Really, truly happy, and that was worth the risk. Antonio's first birthday arrived on a warm spring morning in May. David couldn't believe how fast the year had gone by. The tiny baby he'd helped deliver during that terrible snowstorm was now a chubby, happy toddler who was trying to walk and getting into everything. Rosa had planned a small celebration. She'd made a cake from scratch and decorated the house with colorful streamers. Dr. Peterson was coming over for dinner, and even David's sister was driving down from Billings to meet Antonio for the first time. David sat on the porch steps, watching Rosa chase Antonio around the yard. The little boy was crawling at lightning speed, heading straight for the flower garden Rosa had planted. She scooped him up, laughing as he squealed with delight. No, no, little one, Rosa said, spinning him around. Those flowers are not for eating, Antonio giggled and clapped his hands. Then he looked over at David and reached out his arms. Gotta? Antonio said clearly. David felt his heart stop. It was the first time Antonio had said the word, and he'd said it to him. Rosa froze, her smile fading. Antonio, no, that's not. It's okay, David said quickly, walking over to take the baby. He doesn't understand. But as David lifted Antonio into his arms, he looked into the little boy's eyes and felt that familiar jolt of connection. Antonio had David's stubborn chin, and the same way of tilting his head when he was curious about something. And then David noticed something else. Something that made his blood run cold. Antonio's eyes weren't just brown. They were a very specific shade of amber brown with tiny flecks of gold around the pupils. It was an unusual color, one that David saw every morning in his own mirror. David's grandfather had those same eyes. His father had them too. David had always been told it was a Thompson family trait that skipped some generations, but always showed up eventually. Rosa, David said slowly, still staring at Antonio's eyes. We need to talk. That evening, after Dr. Peterson had gone home and David's sister had driven back to the city, David and Rosa sat at the kitchen table while Antonio slept peacefully in his crib. The house was quiet except for the sound of Rosa's nervous breathing. His eyes, David said finally, they're the same color as mine. Rosa looked down at her hands. I know. How long have you known? Rosa was quiet for so long that David thought she wasn't going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Since the day I first emailed you. David felt like the ground was shifting under his feet. What do you mean? Rosa took a shaky breath. Do you remember being in Denver last year? In February? You stayed at the Marriott Hotel downtown. David searched his memory. He'd gone to Denver to look at some breeding cattle. It had been a quick business trip, just 2 days. He'd stayed at the Marriott because it was close to the stockyards. I remember, he said slowly. There was a bar in the hotel lobby, Rosa continued. You were there on a Thursday night. You were wearing a blue shirt and you looked sad. The memory came flooding back. David had been feeling sorry for himself that night, thinking about his divorce, drinking more than he should have. There had been a woman at the bar, a pretty Filipino woman who was visiting family in Denver before flying back to the Philippines. They'd talked for hours. She'd been warm and funny, and for one night, David had forgotten about his loneliness. One thing had led to another, and they'd spent the night together. In the morning, she was gone before he woke up. That was you? David said, his voice hollow. Rosa nodded, tears streaming down her face. I was visiting my cousin who lives in Denver. I was supposed to fly home the next day. David stared at her, trying to process what she was telling him. You knew Antonio was mine when you came here? Yes, Rosa whispered. When I found out I was pregnant, I didn't know what to do. The man I'd met in Denver was gone, and I only knew his first name. I thought I'd never see him again. So how did you find me? Rosa wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I was desperate. I had no money, no way to support a baby. My friend told me about the marriage website. I thought maybe I could find someone kind who would help me, even if they never knew the truth. David felt anger building in his chest. And then you saw my profile. I recognized you immediately from your picture, Rosa said. I couldn't believe it. The father of my baby was looking for a wife, so you decided to trick me. No, Rosa said urgently. I mean, yes, but not the way you think. David, I read all your messages for weeks before I wrote back. You seem like such a good man. Kind and honest and lonely, just like me. David stood up and paced to the window. You could have told me the truth from the beginning. Would you have believed me? Rosa asked. A woman from another country claiming you were the father of her baby? You would have thought I was lying to trap you. David wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. If some stranger had contacted him claiming he'd gotten her pregnant during a one-night stand, he would have assumed it was a scam. I fell in love with you through your letters, Rosa continued. The way you wrote about your ranch, your dreams, your loneliness. I thought maybe if I came here, if you got to know me, maybe it wouldn't matter how Antonio was conceived. Maybe we could be a real family. David turned around to face her. You still should have told me. I tried to so many times, Rosa said, tears flowing freely now, but I was scared. I was already in love with you before I even got on the plane. And when I got here, when I saw how good you were, how much you needed someone to care about you, I couldn't bear the thought of losing you. David sank back into his chair. His mind was reeling. Antonio was his son, his actual biological son. The child he'd been falling in love with for the past year was his own flesh and blood. That night in Denver, David said slowly, I told you about my ranch, didn't I? Rosa nodded. You said you raised cattle in Montana. You talked about how beautiful it was, how peaceful. You said you'd inherited it from your father. And you remembered all of that when you saw my profile. Every word, Rosa said. You were so passionate when you talked about your home. It made me want to see it for myself. David was quiet for a long time, staring at the table. Finally, he looked up at Rosa. Why are you telling me this now? Because I can't live with the lie anymore, Rosa said. And because Antonio deserves to know his real father. You've been acting like his father anyway. You love him, I can see it. And he loves you too. As if summoned by their conversation, Antonio's cry came from the bedroom. Rosa started to get up, but David stopped her. I'll get him, he said. David walked into Antonio's room and picked up the fussy baby. Antonio immediately calmed down and snuggled against David's chest. Hey there, little man, David whispered. Having trouble sleeping? Antonio looked up at him with those familiar amber eyes and made a happy gurgling sound. He reached up and patted David's cheek with his small hand. "Dada," Antonio said again, clear as day, this time. David didn't correct him. David carried Antonio back to the kitchen, where Rosa was still sitting at the table, watching nervously. "He really is mine," David said, more to himself than to Rosa. "Yes," Rosa said softly. "He has your eyes, your stubborn chin. Sometimes when he's concentrating on something, he gets the same little wrinkle between his eyebrows that you do." David looked down at Antonio, who was now reaching for the salt shaker on the table. "All this time, I've been falling in love with my own son." "And he's been falling in love with his real father?" Rosa said. David felt something break open inside his chest, but this time it wasn't pain, it was relief. All those moments when he'd felt connected to Antonio, all those times when caring for the baby had felt natural and right, it made sense now. "I'm angry with you," David said finally, looking at Rosa. "You should have told me from the beginning." "I know," Rosa said, fresh tears starting. "I'm sorry. I was scared and stupid, and I handled everything wrong." "But," David continued, "I understand why you did it, and I can't be too angry about something that brought me my son." Rosa's eyes widened with hope. "Does this mean—" "It means we have a lot to figure out," David said, "but we're going to figure it out together. As a family, a real family this time." Antonio chose that moment to say "Mama" while reaching for Rosa, then "Dada" while patting David's chest. David and Rosa looked at each other and started laughing through their tears. "I think he's got us figured out already," David said. "Children are smarter than we think," Rosa agreed. That night, after they'd put Antonio back to bed, David and Rosa sat on the porch talking until dawn. They talked about that night in Denver, about the year they'd spent getting to know each other, about their hopes for the future. "I love you," Rosa said, as the sun was coming up. "I've loved you since your first letter. That's the truth. I love you too," David said, and meant it. "Both of you, my family." As they watched the sunrise over the ranch, Antonio woke up and called for them from his crib. Together, David and Rosa went to get their son, ready to start their new life as the family they were always meant to be.